Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Book Review blog. Today we're going to review the book The Green Mile by Stephen King. Originally, it was published in 1995-96, and originally it was not published as a big novel, but as 6 installment books. There you are. And Stephen King did this to try something new. He remarks that he remembers when, in like the late 19th century, when Charles Dickens started doing something like that, and he wondered about, would this work in today's standards, and would this work for me and my readers? So he decided to try it out. And what it's about is it's about a man named Paul Edgecombe, and at the present time he is an older man who lives in a retirement home in the South. It doesn't really give exactly what state he lives in. My guess would be Georgia, just from different things in the book and other things like that. So anyway, and Paul has been having bad dreams about something that's happened in his youth or in his middle age, dealing with where he works. And so what he does is he ends up starting to write down what has happened. And when Paul was, an adult before he retired, he was a prison guard at the Cold Mountain Penitentiary, also in Georgia, let's say. It was also in the South. And he was in charge of the death row portion of the penitentiary, known as the E Block. And he was there with about 4 other full-time guards, let's call them, because there were full-time guards, and then there were like floater guards that he talks about. The other guards that were in this part of the prison were named Brutus Howell, who people called Brutal, Henry Terwilliger, Dean Stanton, and Percy Wetmore. And like I said, there were other kind of floaters that he mentions. And at the time when he starts writing about this book, or this time, the only inmate that's currently on death row at the time is a man named Edouard Delacroix. He was in for raping and killing a woman, and in attempts to get rid of the body, he lit her on fire, but that caused her apartment, which was nearby, to also be lit on fire, and instead of killing one woman, as he intended, he killed about 6 people. So, regardless, he's now on death row. So, but when the story begins, they get a new inmate, and his name is John Coffey. And John Coffey is described as a very big, very tall African-American man. And I think they mentioned that his height is 6'8". But, I mean, he's just built. He's, not a lanky 6'8". He's a very muscular, very big guy. And he is in the death row portion of the prison because he is accused and found guilty of raping and killing a set of twin girls who are about maybe 9 years old, let's say. And, I mean, unfortunately, you have to understand this was, the year was 1932, and it was in the South. So, I mean, there really wasn't any justice for African Americans at the time, even though, they were free. And they found John with the girls in his hands. They were kind of under his arms. So, obviously, they were put with him. So, he was immediately found guilty and sent to death row. And one of the things that you need to know about John is that he's a very simple fellow. I mean, he's not very intelligent. He doesn't really talk much. And when Paul is in charge of kind of the initial interview where where he meets the inmates and the inmate meets the guards, things like that, he says, well, your name is John Coffey. And John Coffey's like, well, yes, like the drink, just not spelled the same. And so that's kind of all he says. except for when Paul is about to leave. John says to him, I couldn't help it. I tried to take it back, but it was too late. And Paul assumes or thinks that he's referring to, he's sorry for what he did that got him in jail, but, he can't take it back. So there really isn't anything that they can do at the time. So, and then they kind of live their lives as prison guards. You do meet Paul's wife. Her name is Jan. They have children who are fully grown, because Paul is about 40 years old at the time. And, but after John comes into their lives on the prison, things start to change, or things kind of start to get interesting. The first thing that happens is that the prison is introduced to a mouse, and who Brutal calls Steamboat Willie. And this mouse is, just goes right up to the people and, gets food from the guards and is just very friendly. And he becomes friendly with Edouard Delacroix as well. And Edouard is like, oh, well, no, this mouse is not named Steamboat Willie. This mouse is named Mr. Jingles. He whispered it in my ear, and the guards are, just kind of whimsical about it. They're like, all right, fine, you're, if you want a mouse, you can have one, because, you don't have that much time left on this prison, or, of life, so if one final joy is fine for you. All the guards are like this, like I said, except for Percy. And Percy and Edouard, just did not get on the wrong foot, or just did not get on the right foot on the start. There was an altercation when Edouard got to the prison, and it just kind of went downhill from there. And so Edouard is always afraid of Percy because Percy is a bully to him and just kind of throws his guardship around and says, I can make life for you miserable on this block and things like that. So, one of the things that Paul is also dealing with, as far as like a personal thing, is he's also dealing with a bladder infection, and it's really bad. And I mean, they say to go to the doctor, but he just refuses, because again, this is kind of like 1932, like I said, so the medicine that they have isn't what they have now, where, it's like awful tablets that he has to take, and he doesn't want to do that, so he just kind of lives with it. And one of the things that, when he's on the prison, John basically makes no noise or no anything, and, but he, at one point, tells Paul, he's like, I need to talk to you. And so Paul, wanders to his cell, and he's like, well, what do you want? And John says, I just want to help. And he grabs Paul and kind of puts his hand on his, crotch, basically, and ends up healing Paul of his bladder infection. And by doing nothing, other than just touching him, and it ends up that John expels a kind of black flies, as they call it, out of his mouth, which Paul makes that was his sickness of the bladder infection. So now Paul is really like, oh my gosh, who are we dealing with? This guy is not a normal in prison inmate. This is not somebody who, you would think would murder people. So he starts to get suspicion of if John really committed the crime to begin with. And so he has that in the back of his mind. And there's other things, of course, that go on in the prison. One of the things that also goes on is they get a new inmate. And his name is William Wharton, although he is known as Wild Bill. He's a very young, he's about 19 years old. And, I mean, this guy is just kind of a bad apple. Basically, he's got, a wild streak, and that causes him to do reckless things. And I think he, robbed a bank or robbed something, and ended up killing people, which got him let into the prison. So, well, the first time that you meet Wild Bill, he basically takes Dean hostage with, you know, his handcuffs. Like, he's got him, you know, locked behind, and he's choking Dean, and they're trying to get him off him and things like that. So, you know, it's a big introduction to Wild Bill Wharton. And so again, life goes on at the prison, and it's nearing the time of Edouard Delacroix's execution. And one of the things that Edward and Mr. Jingles have bonded over is that Mr. Jingles is really talented. He can do things, like he can fetch things, and he, you know, Edward is like, well, you know, this is no ordinary mouse. This is like a circus mouse. He can do tricks and things like that. And again, the guards they want to make Edward's life livable, because, again, he's about to be executed. And so they don't play tricks, but they kind of like, well, if, you know, this mouse should go to Mouseville in Florida. And, like, Edward's like, what's Mouseville? And they're like, oh, you know, it's a place where mice go and they give shows for adults and, you know, kids, and there's mice that do all sorts of tricks. And Edward's, like, really happy about this, and he's like, well, good, Mr. Jingles will be taken care of. Well, one of the things that happens while they're having this conversation is that Mr. Jingles ends up going out of Edward's cell, and Percy steps on him and crushes him. Like, they hear bones crack. And Edward is, of course, really upset, and he's, like, thrashing all around. And the guards are, like, all shocked, because why would Percy do something like this? But again, Percy's a bully. So John ends up saying, give him to me, and he ends up healing Mr. Jingles. And again, same way that John healed Paul. And so there's another sign of that John is much different than any other inmate that they've had. So it's the day of Edward's execution, and Percy has asked if he could be up front and lead the thing. And again, they're very annoyed with Percy, and Percy's like, well, give me this opportunity to lead an execution, and then you'll be done with me. I'll move on. I'll quit at the prison, and I'll move on. So they're like, okay, fine, we'll give you that. And so Edward's death does not go well, because Percy is, again, a bully, and he just decides that, you know, to give Edward, you know, one more bad deal. And so, again, life goes on, like I said, and one of the things that also happens is that the warden of this whole Coal Mountain Penitentiary, his name is Hal Moores, he has a wife named Melinda, and she is dying of a brain tumor. And Paul gets it in his head that, well, John cured me of my bladder infection. He healed Mr. Jingles, who's basically almost dead. Could he heal Melinda Moores? And instead of bringing Melinda into the prison, Paul, Brutal, and Harry really risk and Dean, basically, they risk their lives and their jobs by taking John out of the prison and to Melinda. And Melinda is there, and John ends up healing her. And so which is, like, remarkable, obviously, one of the things that also, and then after that also happens, is that they have to kind of deal with Percy, and so they throw him into the lockdown, you know, padded cell or the restraint room, And when John, heals Melinda, he takes her her cancer or her tumor into him, but he doesn't expel it out like he did with Paul, like in the black flies. Instead, what he does is that when Percy is dismissed from the restraint room, John grabs him and sends all of his black flies into Percy. And they're like, oh my gosh, is this okay? What happened? And ends up happening is that Percy walks around a little bit and he's in front of William Wharton's cell, and Percy pulls out his gun and kills William. And one of the things, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this, and this is important. One of the things that happens while John is exiting the cell and going to Melinda's house, excuse me, William grabs him, and John is really shaken up by this, and because John is feeling something that's happening out of William, and I'm going to leave it like that. I mean, again, John gets executed, and it's really sad because Paul is confirmed that John did not do this crime, and it doesn't happen like the movie happens, where, you see the vision. Paul just kind of figures it out, and through deductive reasoning and deductive skills, and realizes that William Wharton did the crime. The movie is very close to the book. If you've seen the movie, you don't need to read the book. I know that's really shocking for me to say this, because I would never say that in most cases. But if I wish that I had read the book before watching the movie, because it's basically almost like a screenplay of the movie. Just, there's extra things that happen again in the retirement home. That's a little important, but really not. So, anyway, that's it for this book. The next book that I'm going to read by Stephen King is called The Regulators. Unfortunately, I don't have the binding for it. So, anyway, that's it. I bid you all farewell, and happy reading.